Chief Silas Rourke had a voice built for rooms like this one, and he used it the way he used everything, to fill the space where other people might have stood. The briefing tent smelled of wet canvas and rifle oil, and half the troop was still shaking rain off their sleeves when he leaned back against the map table and looked at the small woman in the corner, like she was a chair someone had left out in the weather. "No," he said, "absolutely not. I'm not hanging my guys' lives on a rumor." Commander Aldrich hadn't even finished the sentence. He'd said her name and the word Overwatch in the same breath, and Rourke had cut across him before the second word cooled. Everyone in the tent knew what he meant. Everyone had heard the story about Sergeant Sabine Larkin, the Marine they'd bolted onto the task force at the last minute. 5'3" in her boots, 130 pounds soaking wet, with a service record that read like a misprint. There was a shot in it. A harbor, a moving boat, a distance nobody wanted to say out loud because saying it made you sound gullible. "That harbor thing is a campfire story," Rourke said to the room, not to her. "Somebody added a 0. Nobody makes that shot, especially not her." He let his eyes travel over her once, top to bottom, and found nothing worth the trip. "I've got shooters who've earned their Overwatch. She's a mascot they pinned to my op, so a general could check a box." Sabine Larkin did not move. She sat with her forearms on her knees and her hands loose between them, and she watched Rourke the way you watch weather you already know is coming. No flush in her face, no tightening at the jaw. The men waited for her to defend herself, because that was what you did when a man like Rourke stood on your neck in front of a crowd. And when she didn't, when she just breathed, slow, the 4 count, in through the nose, and hold, and out, a couple of them shifted, uneasy, without knowing why. It wasn't the stillness of someone who'd been beaten. It was the stillness of someone who already knew how the night was going to end, and was only waiting for the rest of them to catch up. She did not yet know it would take 6 hours and 31 men. If you've ever been underestimated, written off, talked over, sized up and set aside by someone who never bothered to find out what you could do, stay with this one, because it's for you. Hit subscribe so the channel can keep telling stories the way they deserve to be told. And drop the name of your city in the comments so we can see how far this one travels tonight. And stay to the end. Stay for the moment a man who called her a mascot has to key a radio in the dark and say her name like it's the last dry match in his pocket. Because when that happens, you're going to want to have watched every second that led up to it. This is the story of the night the SEALs were surrounded by 38 men, and the small woman on the ridge who took the valley apart one shot at a time. To understand why nobody in that tent believed her, you have to go back 3 weeks to the range at the forward base, and the way she moved when she thought no one was watching. The base sat where a jungle valley folded down toward a slow brown river, in a country the maps still argued about. And the rain came twice a day, like a scheduled appointment. Everything sweated. The sandbags sweated. The plywood sweated. The air was so thick with water that a round dropped a little farther than the tables said it should. And Sabine had spent her first afternoon there, learning that drop the way other people learn a new stairwell in the dark, by feeling for it once and never forgetting. She didn't shoot the way the SEAL snipers shot, in bursts of confidence with a spotter calling wind beside them. She shot alone, and she shot slow. And between rounds, she would go completely still for so long that a young radio watch stander named Ames, 19 years old, and terrified of everyone, thought the first time he saw her that her rifle had jammed. Then the rifle spoke, once, and 800 meters away, a swinging steel plate, the size of a dinner tray, took the hit dead center, and Ames watched her already cycling the bolt before the clang came back across the valley, like she'd heard the future and gotten bored waiting for it. He didn't have the words for what he'd seen. He only knew that the other snipers, the big loud ones, made a sound when they shot, and she made almost none. And hers was the one that scared him. She'd been raised on a hardpan range in the hill country by a woman named Dell, who was not her mother and not her blood, who had run a shooting range out of spite and stubbornness because the Marine Corps of her own era had never once let her deploy, kept her stateside, kept her instructing, kept her behind the glass, while men she'd outshot went and did the things she'd trained her whole life to do. Dell was still alive. Dell still answered the phone with her rifle cleaning kit spread across the kitchen table, and Dell had never once told Sabine to find her peace or listen for the quiet or any of that. Dell taught aggression disguised as calm. "Patience isn't waiting," she used to say, hard, jabbing a finger into the wood. Patience is refusing to be rushed into a miss. You don't get to hurry. You don't get to hope. The shot is already there. Your only job is to not screw it up before it arrives. She'd been wrong about plenty. She'd been wrong the day she pushed a 19-year-old Sabine into a competition shot she wasn't ready for and watched her come apart on the line. And she'd said afterward, gruff, that some lessons you had to buy at full price. But she'd been right about the thing that mattered. She'd built a shooter who did not flinch, who did not gamble, who treated her own breathing like a slow 4-count metronome she could set the whole world to. Sabine had no keepsake in her pocket. She had the 4-count, and she had a dead calm way of settling into a rifle that wasn't peace at all. It was a hunter going quiet. The task force didn't know any of that. The task force knew Rourke. He wasn't a fraud, and that was the worst of it. Silas Rourke could shoot, could lead, could carry a wounded man 3 kilometers over broken ground, and still have breath left to crack a joke about it. He'd earned the trident and the respect a dozen times over, which meant that when he decided a person didn't count, it wasn't ignorance. It was a verdict, and men trusted his verdicts. 2 days after the range, Sabine walked into the operations center to check the imagery of the objective, and Rourke was already there, holding court, and he saw her and pitched his voice for the room. "There she is, the mascot." He grinned. "Careful, she'll shoot the printer." A couple of the younger guys laughed because you laughed at what Rourke said. She crossed to the light table, studied the overhead of the valley, the ruined colonial plantation, the tumbled stone of a town called Ferran that had been dying since before any of them were born, the bell tower standing over it like a headstone. She traced the ridge lines with one finger. She said nothing. She left. Rourke told the room she probably couldn't read a map, and Ames, the radio kid, opened his mouth to say something and then didn't because he was 19, and Rourke was Rourke. And that silence sat in his chest for 3 weeks like a stone. Commander Aldrich saw all of it and let it happen. That was the part he'd have to live with. He was a decent officer and a coward in exactly one specific way. He would not spend his own capital to defend someone who couldn't defend themselves in the currency the room respected. He'd read her file. He'd seen the harbor entry and the sworn statements attached to it and the range scores that made the analysts double-check the units. He knew. And every time Rourke ran her down, Aldrich found something on his clipboard to look at and told himself it wasn't his fight, and let the silence do what silence always does, which is give permission. The op was supposed to be clean. Insert a SEAL troop at last light. Snatch a courier moving through Ferran. Exfil before the valley woke up. Rourke's element on the ground. Aldrich in the operations center. Sabine held back at the base because Rourke had made it a condition. No marine tourist on his overwatch. Put her on the QRF bird, if you have to put her anywhere. So she sat in the ready tent in her kit, with her rifle across her knees and her radio low, and she listened to the op go wrong. It went wrong at 2140. The first sign was the courier not being where he was supposed to be. The second was the tree line coming alive. What the imagery had called a sleepy ruin was a staging point, and the SEALs walked into the middle of 38 men who'd been waiting for a payday to walk into the middle of them. The net went from clipped and calm to a stack of voices climbing over each other. Contact front, contact left. They're behind us. Rourke's voice cut through hard and level, pushing his men into the stone shells of the plantation. And for a few minutes it held. And then the enemy did the thing amateurs don't do. They didn't rush. They spread. They closed a ring around the ruins and started tightening it. And the SEALs' fire began to sound different, more careful, the sound of men counting rounds. In the operations center, Aldrich stared at the icons on the screen and understood he was watching a troop get surrounded in real time, and that the QRF birds were 40 minutes out through weather, and that 40 minutes was longer than the SEALs had. "I need eyes above them," he said. "I need someone who can thin that ring from range, or they don't last to the birds." Options. His intelligence chief looked at the imagery and said the thing no one wanted to hear. There was no overwatch position with line of sight into Ferran. The ridges around the valley all fell away wrong, or the vegetation choked the angle, or the one bare spur that looked down into the ruins was 600 meters out and canted so badly that the analysts had ruled it out weeks ago. You couldn't see the courtyard from there, only slivers of it between the buildings, and no shooter could work a target set through slivers in the dark. Sabine had seen that spur 3 weeks ago on the light table. She had traced it with one finger. She had already run the geometry in her head and known something the analysts didn't, which was that you didn't need to see the whole courtyard. You needed to see the alleys the enemy had to move through to close the ring. And from the canted spur, if you lay in exactly the right place and were willing to take shots most people would call impossible, you could see every one of those alleys for a half second at a time as men crossed them. It wasn't a firing position. It was a keyhole, and she was the only person on the base small enough and patient enough and stubborn enough to shoot a war through a keyhole. She was already walking to the QRF bird when Aldrich's call came over the net, and the thing he said cost him something, and everyone in the operations center heard it cost him. "Get me the Marine," Aldrich said. A pause. Then quieter, because it was an admission, and he knew it. "Get me Larkin, now. She's the only shot we've got." Ames on the radio desk. felt the stone in his chest turn over. They flew her in low and dropped her short of the spur, and she went the last 400 meters on foot. Alone, no spotter, no security. A small shape moving through wet elephant grass with a rifle and a spotting scope, and the 4 count going in her chest. The rain had thinned to mist. Below her, through the grass, she could see Ferran burning in 3 places, muzzle flashes stitching the dark. And she could hear it, the flat crack of the SEALs' rifles, the deeper hammering of a belt-fed gun the enemy had set up somewhere in the ruins. The 2 sounds arguing across the valley. She found the canted rock. She lay down on it the way you'd lie down on a lover you hadn't seen in a year, careful and certain, and she built her position in 90 seconds, and she keyed the radio. Her first transmission was the first time most of them had heard her voice on the net, and after 3 weeks of mascot and tourist and campfire story, it landed on the operations center like cold water. "Overwatch is set," she said, flat, unhurried. "I have the alleys. Tell your men to hold the courtyard and let me work the edges. Kestrel is hunting." Then she went to work. The first man died crossing an alley he'd crossed a dozen times that night, thinking it was safe because it was dark and nobody had hit him yet. He stepped into the gap between 2 stone walls, and 600 meters away, a rifle she'd zeroed for this exact water-heavy air spoke once, and he folded before the sound reached him. She was already off him, glass sweeping to the next alley, when the crack rolled across the valley. In the operations center, nobody said anything. On the ground, one of the SEALs said, "Somebody's shooting for us," in a voice that didn't quite believe it. The second man died reaching for the first. "That's 2, she said on the net, no heat in it, a clerk reading a ledger. Below her, the enemy's ring didn't understand yet. It was still tightening, still confident, men flitting through the alleys to get into position for the final push, and every alley was a keyhole, and she owned every keyhole. 3? She read a machine gun team relocating along the tree line, 3 men carrying the belt-fed and its ammunition to a new spot where it could rake the courtyard, and she took the gunner first, so the gun went silent mid-burst, then the man who grabbed for it, then let the third one run, because a man running away was doing her work for her. "Guns down," she said. "That's 5. The ring stopped tightening. It's a specific thing, the moment a confident enemy realizes they're being hunted back. And Sabine watched it happen through the glass. The flitting shapes going still, men pressing into cover, the whole loose net of them clenching up as the understanding spread that the alleys weren't safe, that something on the high ground was reaching into their formation and plucking them out one at a time. She let them clench. A clenched enemy stops advancing, and a SEAL troop that isn't being advanced on is a SEAL troop that gets to breathe. "Bishop, this is Overwatch," she said. "Your north and east are quieting down. Push a team to the tower before they figure out they can still use it. I'll cover the crossing." Down in the ruins, Rourke heard a woman's voice on his net telling him how to run his fight. And for one hot second, the old contempt rose up in him. And then a man he hadn't seen, a man about to put a burst into his lead element from a window, came apart against the far wall, and the crack of the shot that did it rolled in a full second later, and Rourke shut his mouth and moved his team like she'd said. 6, 7, 8. She did not hurry. That was the thing the enemy couldn't account for, because everything in a firefight screams at you to hurry, to spray, to fill the dark with lead and hope. She refused. Dell's voice sat under her own breathing. You don't get to hurry. The shot is already there. And she found each man and waited the quarter second it took for the sight picture to be true, and only then let the rifle speak. And it was true every time. 11 by the time the enemy tried to rush the courtyard in a body to overwhelm the SEALs, before this ghost on the ridge could stop them. And she broke that rush the way you break a wave, taking the man in front so the men behind him tripped over the idea of dying. And by the time they'd untangled it, the moment was gone, and 4 more of them were down. 15. Then they found her. Not her, exactly. Her muzzle. A patient enemy of their own, and there was at least one, there always is, had been lying in the ruins, backtracking her shots, timing the crack against the flash, and he'd worked out the arc and put the belt-fed's replacement, a second gun she hadn't accounted for, onto the spur. The first she knew of it was the grass in front of her face disintegrating. The world narrowed to a hot, bright tunnel. She saw the grass stems whipping and vanishing as rounds walked toward her through them. Saw the muzzle of the gun far below strobing in the dark, a hard, white pulse she could have set a watch by. She heard it a half second after she saw it, the deep, tearing hammer of a heavy machine gun that turns air into something solid, and under it the wet slap of rounds hitting the rock beside her cheek and throwing stone chips that stung like wasps across her jaw. She felt the spur shudder, felt a chip open a hot line under her eye, tasted copper and rain. And in the middle of all of it, her mind did the cold arithmetic it had been built to do. The gun was traversing left to right. It would reach her in under 2 seconds. She could not outshoot a machine gun, but she did not have to. She only had to not be where it thought she was. She rolled, off the good rock, off the keyhole, into a fold of ground a body length left, as the burst chewed through the exact place her chest had been, and kept going. And she came up already prone, in the new spot, with the gun still walking through empty grass, and she found the gunner in her scope, lit by his own flashes, and she took him at the top of his own tracer stream. The gun stopped. Its ammunition bearer grabbed the grips. She took him too. "Gun down," she said, and only then noticed she was breathing hard and made herself stop and reset the 4 count with blood running warm into the corner of her mouth. "That's 17. I've displaced. Firing points compromised. Working from the fold." "Overwatch. Say status. You're hit." Aldrich's voice tight. "Negative," she said, which was a small lie, because a face full of rock chips isn't a wound. It's just weather. "Kestrel is up. Keep pushing them to the tower." 18. 19. The enemy tried to break contact now, tried to peel away from the ruins and melt into the tree line. And this was the most dangerous thing they could do, because a broken enemy who escapes is an enemy who comes back tomorrow. But it was also, for the men in the ruins, salvation. And Sabine had to choose in real time which mattered. She chose the men. She took the ones who turned to fire, covering bursts so their friends could run. And she let the runners run, and the ring came apart from the inside out. 20. 22. A man tried to drag a wounded friend to cover, and she let them both go, and filed it somewhere behind her sternum, the small mercy she could afford, because the tide had turned. 23. 25. Then the compounding thing, the thing that always comes when you think you've got it. Her count of remaining rounds ran short. She'd flown in light, expecting to shoot a target set, not a war, and she was down to her last magazine and change with fighters still moving in the ruins. She keyed the net, calm, because panic on the radio kills people. Bishop, Overwatch. I'm running low on the ridge. Prioritize your breakout. I've got maybe 8 good ones left in me. Make them matter. And she made every one of the 8 matter, and the last of them dropped a man who'd gotten inside the SEAL's line and had a grenade half out of his vest, and the crack of that shot was the last thing the enemy in Faran had the stomach for. 26. The ring was gone. Overwatch is black on ammo, she said, and the flatness finally had a floor under it, a bottom she'd reached. The valley's yours. Move your wounded. And there it was, the moment the op should have ended. The birds inbound now, through breaking weather. The enemy fled. The SEALs alive in the stone shells of a dead town because a mascot on a ridge had taken the whole night apart with a rifle and a slow heartbeat. Aldrich exhaled in the operations center like a man setting down something heavy. Ames on the radio desk was crying and didn't know it. 26 men, 6 hours. One shooter, alone, no spotter, working a war through slivers of alley in the rain. She came down off the ridge as the first bird flared into the clearing south of Faran, and she walked into the casualty collection point with her rifle slung and her face streaked with blood and stone dust, and she found the reason the whole thing had felt like standing on the edge of a cliff the entire 6 hours. His name was Cade Ellison. He was 23. He had a photograph of an ultrasound folded into the top of his boot because his wife was due in 5 weeks, and he liked to know it was there. And now he was on his back in the wet grass, with a corpsman's hands full and failing at the mess a round had made of his upper thigh, the femoral, the bad one, blood pumping bright and fast into the mud with every beat of a heart that was running out of things to pump. The corpsman was good, and the corpsman was losing. And Sabine, who had spent 6 hours being the coldest thing on the ridge, dropped to her knees in the blood and put her small hands where they were needed without being asked, found the artery under the ruin of muscle, and clamped it with 2 fingers and her whole weight, pressing until her forearms shook, buying seconds the way she'd bought them all night, patiently, refusing to be rushed, refusing to hope, doing the next true thing and only the next true thing. True. You're the ridge, Ellison said. His voice was going thin and far away. His eyes found her face, the blood on it, the stillness under the blood. You're the one who... He couldn't finish. His hand came up and closed on her sleeve, and the fear that men keep out of their voices all night was in his grip. Am I going to see my kid? He said. It wasn't quite a question. It was a boy asking the only thing that mattered of the one person on that field who hadn't been wrong yet. She held his eyes, and she held his artery, and she did not look away, and she did not soften it into comfort, because comfort was a thing you offered when you weren't sure. And she was sure. You're going to be there when she comes, Sabine said. Flat. Certain. A fact she was reading off the future the way she read wind. You're going to hold her. I've got you. I don't miss. And she gave him the only warmth she let herself show the entire night, a thing no one on that ridge would have believed the ice-cold ghost capable of. She leaned down close and put her forehead for 1 second against his, blood to blood, and murmured something no radio caught, just for him, and something in his chest steadied and held on. She kept 2 fingers clamped on that artery through the loading, through the flight, would not let go. Walked her hands up onto the litter and into the bird with him. And when they finally pried her off at the surgical tent, her fingers had locked into a claw she had to open with her other hand. He lived. She had told him he would, and he did. She would learn, weeks later, that they named the girl after nobody in particular, just a name the parents liked. She never told them it should have been Dell. She thought it was over. It was not over. This is the part where it stops being a hunt and becomes something worse. The birds had lifted with the wounded and half the troop, and the second bird was inbound for the rest, and Rourke's element, Rourke himself, and 4 men, and 1 more casualty, on a litter, had pushed to the south, clearing to load, when the valley showed them the card it had been holding. The enemy who'd fled hadn't fled. They'd fallen back on the one hard point in Ferran the seals hadn't cleared because there'd been no time. The old bell tower over the town, stone thick, tall, with a commanding view of every clearing a helicopter could use. And a second, fresh force had come up the river road in the dark. 40 more men under a leader who did not run and did not panic. And they took the tower. And from the tower, they killed the second bird's approach with a wall of fire that forced it to wave off. And in doing so, they cut Rourke's element off from the extraction and pinned them in a shallow stone stock pen 100 meters below the tower's guns. And now it was personal, because now the man on the tower had a plan, and the plan was leverage. Sabine, back on the ridge with her scavenged rounds. She'd walked to the casualty point and taken magazines off the wounded, who wouldn't need them. A dozen rounds, begged and borrowed. That was all. Watched through her glass as the pale-shirted commander in the tower did the thing she'd been afraid of. His men had grabbed the SEAL casualty off the litter in the confusion. A young operator named Priya's brother. No, a young operator whose name she didn't have yet, gut-shot and helpless, and dragged him and one of the local plantation caretakers, an old man who'd been hiding in the ruins for 3 days, up into the tower's open top. And the commander stood them at the parapet where the pinned SEALs below could see, and he keyed a captured radio, and his voice came onto the American net in careful English. "You will lay down your weapons," he said, "or I will put these 2 off this tower, 1 at a time, starting now, and you will watch." He wanted Rourke's element to surrender. Surrender meant the whole thing on video, meant leverage, meant a nightmare that outlived the night. And he had every card. He had height, numbers, hostages, and darkness. And the pinned SEALs had a shallow wall and dwindling ammunition, and a wounded man of their own. And the birds couldn't come near the tower's guns, and the QRF ground element was an hour out on bad roads. There was one thing on the board that could reach the top of that tower. In the operations center, Aldrich stared at the impossible geometry and knew it. Everyone knew it. And Rourke, in the stock pen, with rounds cracking off the stone above his head, and a man on the radio promising to throw a boy off a tower, understood in one sick lurch that the only asset on the field who could kill the man on that parapet without hitting the 2 people standing beside him, a shot into the top of a tower 640 meters away, at night past 2 hostages, at a target that would not hold still, was the mascot, was the tourist, was the campfire story he had spent 3 weeks grinding under his boot. And to get her, he had to ask. The net went quiet. In the operations center, they watched the seconds pass and understood what the silence was. It was a man's whole idea of himself, standing in a doorway, deciding whether to walk through. Rourke's breathing came over the open channel, ragged, the breathing of a man who has just watched his own certainty die in front of him, and has to say so out loud, on the record, in front of every man he'd ever performed for. Someone off mic in the stock pen said a name, her name, like a question, like a prayer. And still Rourke didn't key it. And the man on the tower said, "You are out of time," and grabbed the old caretaker by the collar and pushed him to the edge, and Rourke keyed the radio. Kestrel. His voice cracked on the second syllable, and he didn't try to hide it, because there was no room left in him for hiding anything. Kestrel, this is Rourke. A breath. I've got 2 hostages on the top of the tower, and a man about to put them over the side. 640 meters. He's dead center between them. I can't. The word can't came out of Silas Rourke like a tooth. I can't do anything from down here. I need you. We all need you. Please, take the shot. Every man on the net heard it. The mascot, the tourist, please. In the operations center, a chief who'd laughed at one of Rourke's jokes 3 weeks ago stood up without knowing he'd stood. On the ridge, Sabine Larkin was already building the position. She had heard the ultimatum. She had already been reading the tower, because that was the difference between her and everyone who underestimated her. While they were realizing there was a problem, she was already 3 steps into solving it. She lay in the fold of ground with her dozen scavenged rounds, and she looked at what the shot actually was, and it was worse than distance. Distance was arithmetic. This was 3 problems stacked on top of each other, any one of which could kill the 2 people she was trying to save. It was dark. First, full dark, the tower a black cutout against a barely there sky. And the only thing painting the man at all was the orange throb of a truck burning at the tower's base. Light that flickered and lied, that made a face appear, and vanish, and appear a ½ inch to the left of where it had been. It was crowded. Second, the commander stood between the boy and the old man, dead center, the way a smart man stands so that a shot pulled left killed a hostage, and a shot pulled right killed a hostage, and only a shot threaded exactly down the seam between them touched him at all. A seam maybe 14 inches wide, at 640 meters, which is a coin held at arm's length, and it was alive. Third, he would not hold still. He was pacing that parapet, gesturing, working his men. A moving target in bad light, behind a lane, the width of a coin. You could not time this shot. There was no wind seam to wait for, no lull, no rhythm to count. The light wouldn't hold. The target wouldn't hold. If she waited for a clean, still, well-lit picture, it would never come, and the boy would go off the tower while she waited for perfect. So she watched the man instead. She had watched this commander earlier in the night, when he'd been down in the alleys directing the first ring, and she'd filed a thing about him behind her sternum, the way she filed everything, that before he did anything decisive, before he committed, he turned his head and barked to his left, to the man carrying his heavy gun, because he did not act without his gun set. He'd done it all night. It wasn't a rhythm she could count. It was a tell she could anticipate. Once, the single half-second before he threw the old man off the tower, he would turn his head to the left and shout the order that started it. And in that turn, his body would rock a hand's width off the seam, off the 2 hostages, and clear itself into the open against the burning truck's light. He would show her his whole self for exactly as long as it took to give the command to kill someone. That was the shot. Not a window in the weather. A window in a man. "Overwatch has the tower," she said, and her voice was the calmest thing in the entire valley. Calmer than the operations center, calmer than the burning truck, calmer than Rourke's ruined breathing. 640. I have him. Nobody talk. The net went to church silence. In the operations center, Aldrich put both hands flat on the table and leaned on them like the table was the only thing holding the building up. On the ground, Rourke pressed himself to the stone and watched the top of the tower and did not breathe. And Sabine settled into the rifle, into the borrowed rounds, into the 4 count that Dell had built into her before she was old enough to know it was being built, in through the nose, hold, and she let the world shrink to a black tower and a throb of orange light and a coin-width seam of dark. And she let go of hurry, and she let go of hope, because Dell had been right about the one thing that mattered. The shot was already there, standing on that parapet, and her only job was to not screw it up before it arrived. The commander reached for the old caretaker. He turned his head to the left to bark the order. His shoulders rocked off the seam. The truck light caught the pale shirt full on for the length of a heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, Sabine Larkin, 640 meters away, in the dark, alone, with a wounded face and a dozen begged rounds, and the whole weight of 3 weeks of being nobody's shooter, broke the shot she'd been building her entire life to break. The rifle drove back into her shoulder. The round crossed the valley in the time it takes to think the word now, threaded the 14-inch seam between a boy and an old man, and took the commander through the hinge of the jaw and the base of the skull, and he was dead and gone off the back of the parapet before the crack of the shot reached the tower at all. Before the sound even arrived, the man who'd promised to throw children off a tower was simply not there anymore, and the 2 hostages stood untouched in the space where he'd been, swaying alive. For 1 full second, nobody on the net said anything. Then the stock pen erupted, the pinned seals pouring fire up into a tower whose defenders had just watched their leader vanish between 2 prisoners without warning, and the fight went out of the enemy the way air goes out of a lung, and the second bird came in over the broken guns and took Rourke's element, and the 2 hostages and the wounded man off the field, and it was over, and it was really over this time, and the whole thing had turned on a single round that most of the men who'd witnessed it would spend the rest of their lives failing to describe. They didn't believe it. Of course they didn't. Back at the base, in the gray light, the story of the tower shot came apart, the way the harbor story had come apart, because it had to, because a shot like that is easier to call a lie than to live in the same world as. Somebody in another troop said she'd been closer than 640. Somebody said the commander must have already been falling, hit by ground fire, and she'd just gotten lucky with the timing. Somebody said the whole thing was Rourke, covering for a shot one of his own guys made. The word exaggerated went around the way it always did, and it would have stuck, the way it had stuck to the harbor, except that this time the valley had been watched from above. An ISR drone had been on station over Ferran the entire second engagement. Its camera slaved to the tower because the tower was the threat, and it had recorded everything in cold gray infrared. They pulled the footage in the operations center with half the task force crowded in to watch, and there was no arguing with it. There was the tower. There was the commander, center frame, between two heat shapes that were the hostages. There was the exact half-second he turned his head and rocked off the seam. And there was the round. You couldn't see the round, but you could see him drop. Instantly, a puppet, with the strings cut. In the same frame, the muzzle flash bloomed on the distant ridge. The two events close enough to be one event. The flash and the fall, 640 meters apart and simultaneous on the tape. The analysts froze it. They measured it. They ran the range off the drone's own geo-registration, not off anyone's word, and it came back 641 meters. And they measured the gap between the hostage shapes, and it came back close enough to 14 inches that a lieutenant in the back of the room sat down on a footlocker and put his face in his hands. There was no lucky ground fire. There was no other shooter. There was one flash on one ridge and one man falling in one frame. And the tape didn't care what anybody wanted to believe. It had watched a woman thread a coin at 400 yards, past two innocent people in the dark, off a light that flickered and a target that moved, and it played it back as many times as anybody needed until the room went quiet in a completely different way than it had ever gone quiet around her before. She was in the ready tent cleaning her rifle when Rourke came to find her. He came alone, which mattered, because everything Silas Rourke had ever done to her, he'd done in front of an audience, and this he did with no one watching but her. He stood in the tent flap a while, and she let him stand there, working oil into the bolt with the same slow hands that had clamped a boy's artery and threaded a tower, not looking up, not making it easier. His face had changed. That was the thing people would remember about Rourke afterward, the ones who saw him in the days that followed. The loud had gone out of him and left something quieter and heavier in its place. A man carrying a thing he hadn't known he'd have to carry. His hands didn't know what to do. He kept starting to cross his arms, and then not, kept opening his mouth, and then closing it. And when the words finally came, they came broken, the way the profile of every real apology is broken, in pieces that don't fit and have to be forced. "I called you a mascot," he said, and stopped, and made himself go on, because stopping was the coward's version. "In front of everybody. For 3 weeks, His jaw worked. "There's a kid going home to hold his daughter because you were on that ridge when I said you shouldn't be. There's an old man alive who I'd already written off. My guys are alive." He stopped again, and this time, when he started the words, cost him visibly, a physical price paid in front of her, his voice dropping to almost nothing. "I looked at you and I decided I already knew what you were. That's not an accident. That's a thing I chose, over and over. And I was wrong every single time I chose it. And I stood in that operations center tonight, and I had to ask you to save my life after 3 weeks of telling everybody you were a joke." He looked at the floor. He looked at her. His eyes were wet, and he didn't hide it. "I'm sorry. It's not enough. I know it's not enough. But I'm not going to stand here and pretend it was anything smaller than it was. I was wrong about you, Sergeant, all the way down, and I'm going to spend a while making sure everybody who heard me be wrong hears me say it." Sabine set the bolt down on the cloth. She looked at him for a moment with those flat, calculating eyes. And whatever she was reading in him, she found it true. And she gave him the only thing she gave anyone, which was 2 words and no cushion under them. "You asked." That was all. Not "it's fine," because it wasn't, and she didn't lie. Not "forget it," because she wasn't going to. Just an acknowledgement of the one thing he'd done right at the end. That when it counted, when his pride was the only thing standing between a boy and the ground, he'd put it down and said her name. It was more than most men managed. She let him have it, and he took it like a man taking water, and he nodded, and he didn't try to make her say more, which was itself a kind of growth. Commander Aldrich came for her the next morning, and his reckoning was a different shape than Rourke's, because Aldrich's failure had been quieter, and therefore, in its way, worse. Rourke had at least been honest about his contempt, while Aldrich had known better the whole time and looked at his clipboard. He found her at the range, because of course she was at the range, and he stood beside her for a long moment watching her shoot, and she let him, and she could see him struggling with it, the internal thing turning over behind his face. The officer who had read her file and known exactly what she was, and had spent 3 weeks letting another man run her down because it was easier than spending his own standing to stop it. When he finally spoke, it came slow, dragged out over gravel. "I want to say something, and I want to say it right, so bear with me," Aldrich said. He turned his cover over in his hands. "I read your file the day you checked in, the harbor, the scores. I knew exactly what we had, and I let a man in my command call you a mascot to your face in my briefing tent, more than once, because stopping him would have cost me something, and letting it happen was free. That's the truth of it. When silence comes from the top, it isn't neutral. It's a signature. Every time I looked at my clipboard, instead of at Rourke, I was signing off on it. I put men in a valley last night who only got out because of a shooter I'd agreed to leave on the bird to keep the peace with a chief who'd earned his rank and forgotten what it was for. That's on him. But the room he did it in was mine, and I kept it quiet." He stopped. His throat worked. He was not a man used to saying these things, and it showed. And that was what made it land. Then he squared himself and did the officer's version of the thing, the part that wasn't words but action. He told her he was pulling her off the loner roster and onto the task force's primary overwatch billet, permanent, that Rourke's element had already requested her by name for every op going forward, that the recommendation for the valley was already written, and it was not a small one. And then he gave her the recognition, and he made it short because he understood, finally, that she was a person who trusted short over long, 4 words, level, holding everything the 3 weeks hadn't held. "You're my best shooter." Then quieter, an amendment that cost him. "You always were." She looked at him. She nodded once. She went back to the rifle, and Aldrich stood there a moment longer. And then he did the thing he should have done 3 weeks earlier, which was walk back into that operations center and say, in front of everyone, out loud, on the record, what she was, so that no silence of his would ever again do another man's cruelty a favor. Rourke was as good as his word, and the shape it took surprised people. There's a version of a reformed man who just goes quiet, who slinks off and lets the story fade, and Rourke didn't do that. 10 days later, a new draft of replacements came through the base, and one of them, a cocky young sniper who'd heard a garbled version of the valley, made a crack in the chow line about the Marine who got a little too much credit for a lucky shot in the dark. And Rourke, 3 men down the line, set his tray down. He didn't shout. The old Rourke would have shouted. This one walked over, quiet, and stood too close, and said, low enough that only the kid and the men right there could hear it, that he'd been in the stock pen at the bottom of that tower, with a man on the radio promising to throw a boy off the top, and that he'd keyed his own radio and begged the woman that kid was mocking to save his life, and that she'd threaded a coin between 2 hostages in the dark to do it, and that the drone tape was in the intel shop, and the kid was welcome to go watch it before he opened his mouth about her again in a room Rourke was standing in. And then he picked his tray back up and said to the whole silent line, not just the kid, that anyone who wanted to call the tower shot lucky could come find him and say it, and that the offer was open indefinitely. The kid went and watched the tape. He came back different. That was Rourke's penance, and he served it in full and in public, over and over, for as long as it took. The man who'd used a crowd to grind her down now standing in front of crowds to hold her up, which is the only apology that ever actually means anything. The kind you pay in behavior after the words are spent. They confirmed the count, eventually, the way they confirm these things. Sensor data and the ground truth from the QRF that finally rolled into Ferran at dawn and walked the ruins in the alleys and the base of the tower. 26 in the first fight, thinning the ring 1 keyhole at a time so a surrounded troop could breathe. 4 more in the second, in the running scrap around the tower before the shot that ended it. And the commander on the parapet, who they counted separately, always, because everyone who'd seen the tape understood that he wasn't a number. He was a thing apart. 31 men, all told, across one night, by one small woman, with no spotter, working alone. 31. The analysts wrote it in a report, and the report went up the chain. And somewhere far away, people who would never meet her argued about whether to believe it. And the tape sat in a vault and did not care because the tape had been there. Ames found her before she rotated out. The radio kid, 19, who'd watched her hit a steel plate 3 weeks ago and thought her rifle had jammed, who'd wanted to say something in the operations center when Rourke called her a mascot and hadn't, and had carried that silence like a stone. He caught her at the flight line with her rifle case and her pack, waiting for the bird, and he was so nervous his voice shook, but he'd decided he wasn't going to be quiet this time. Not again. "Ma'am, Sergeant, he gave up on being smooth. "I was on the desk that first day at the range. I saw you hit the plate. I didn't understand what I was looking at. I don't think I do now, even after the tape." He swallowed. "But there's a guy going home to a baby, and an old man who gets to die of being old, and my whole troop, and I've been trying to figure out how to say what you are, and the closest I can get is..." And here, the kid, who had no words for any of it, found the only ones that mattered, plain and shaking and true. "You were the reason the radio didn't go quiet all night. When everybody was surrounded, and the whole valley was full of guys who wanted them dead, you were the thing that meant it wasn't over yet. That's what you are to us. You're the reason it wasn't over." And Sabine Larkin, who did not do warmth in public, put her hand on the kid's shoulder for exactly 1 second, and something in her face moved, and she said, "Then don't be quiet next time," and picked up her case. She stood a moment before the bird, alone, small against the enormous gray sky, and she thought about Dell in a kitchen a world away with a cleaning kit spread across the table. Dell who never got to deploy. Dell who'd built her out of stubbornness and refusal and a single unbending rule. She'd call her when she landed. She'd tell her about the keyhole and the tower and the coin-width seam. And Dell would grunt and say something gruff and mean it, and they'd both know what it was. Patience isn't waiting. It's refusing to be rushed into a miss. She'd been rushed by 100 voices, telling her what she was for 3 weeks and for years before that, and she had refused every one of them, and waited for the only argument that couldn't be shouted down, the shot that was already there, standing on a parapet in the dark, needing only that she not screw it up before it arrived. That was the whole of it. That was the thing Dell had known, and the harbor had known, and the tower had proven. Skill was the one thing you couldn't talk a person out of. You could call it luck, and a campfire story, and a misprint in a file. And then the tape rolled, and the round crossed the valley, and the world had to sit in the same room as the truth of you whether it wanted to or not. Somewhere out beyond the wire, the surviving men of a broken enemy were still running, still telling each other about the ghost on the ridge who reached into their formation and plucked them out one at a time, whose gun made almost no sound and never, ever missed, and who had killed their leader between 2 prisoners in the dark from a place they never even saw. And in a briefing tent that had smelled of wet canvas and one man's certainty, that certainty was gone now, collapsed and carried off, replaced by a single quiet fact that every man on that base would carry for the rest of his life, that the smallest person in the room had been the one they couldn't do without, and that they'd nearly let a loud voice throw her away. Sabine Larkin picked up her rifle and stepped onto the bird, and did not look back at the valley she'd taken apart, because a hunter doesn't look at what's already down. She looked forward, level-eyed and still, at whatever came next. Engagement complete. Kestrel was up. And the next time someone underestimated her, and someone always would, she'd do the same thing she'd done every time before. She'd breathe the 4 count and refuse to be rushed and let the shot arrive.